个老宋就做身体吧，这三个不了，身体上的送的个光木头吧，这一阶段那样，当时就啥么年吧人上。
Once again, it was necessary to first make sure that we have the right motivation, and the right proper motivation for listening to these profound teachings of the Dharma should be that through this we will eventually be enabled to bring about the awakening of Buddhahood for each and every sentient being.
만주 니바 나변나 사계나 사계 캠브게 책 조바 캠브나 조바 캠브 책 예소소소소 사계 캠브 양인생인게 라마탐지게 사계 캠브 천재의 조바 캠브 양인생이 담지게 조바 캠브 책이요 다 된다와라 신지라 예바 Gringo, Dupa, Chisora, Mandrava, Memora, Mandra, and the Mombo Pot of Mapa.
Our text continues with the next verse, the first two lines of which say, there are innumerable profound dharmas or teachings, such as Mahamudra and Dzogchen, each with their own definitive, distinct texts. This simply means to say that in either of these two particular traditions, Mahamudra or Mahāti Dzogchen for that matter, there are a great many of commentaries, of treatises, of practice manuals, etc., which could be employed for teaching these particular practices to students. So if any teacher, for instance, within the Mahamudra tradition would teach Mahamudra to his or her students, he or she could employ either very elaborate or medium-length texts. He or she could employ very brief and concise commentaries or practice manuals in order to explain the practice to the students. There are different ways of going about the explanation itself to students. There are various there's different kinds of terminology being employed, and for each of these traditions, Mahamudra or Dzogchen, there are similar such texts of varying lengths and of varying terminology that could be implied. So both traditions have their own very distinct, very clear, very definitive teaching manuals. So when looking at the first sentence of this verse, in which it says there are innumerable profound dharmas such as Mahamudra and Dzogchen, This simply means to say that there are a great number of distinct traditions, of very distinct transmission traditions of these various streams, so to speak, of either Mahamudra or Dzogchen transmission. For instance, if we were to look at the Dzogchen tradition as a whole, it is said in that tradition that the Buddha who originated these teachings, who is the source of these teachings, is the Buddha Samantabhadra. Buddha Samantabhadra passed these teachings on to the first human teacher in the Dzogchen tradition, who was known as Prayavaja or Garab-dorje, who passed it on to Manjushri Mitra onwards to Guru Padmasambhava onwards to the great scholar Vimala Mitra, etc. and so forth. In this particular lineage, a great number of realized masters and scholars, of siddhas, etc. have appeared, and each of them has passed on the tradition of Dzogchen in a very particular way, in a very unmistaken way. And in this way, the various lineages of Dzogchen transmission have come together. Each of these transmits the teachings of Dzogchen in a very clear, in a very unmistaken, and in a very distinct way. It is very much the same case in the Mahamudra tradition. If one were to follow the Mahamudra tradition as a whole, one would say that the Buddha who originally taught these teachings is the Buddha Vajradhara, who is also known as Dorje Chang in Tibetan. He passed these teachings on to the Bodhisattva Ratnamati, who passed it on to the human master Saraha, from there onwards to Nagarjuna, and so forth, throughout the various masters of the lineage, who again, in turn, developed their own very distinct and unmistaken ways of continuing the tradition. In this way, these both traditions, who originally, nothing else but the word of the Buddha himself, who reflect nothing else but that which the Buddha himself has taught, have developed their own very particular, their own very distinct, and their own unmistaken transmission traditions. And according to the one or the other of these unmistaken and distinct traditions, either Dzogchen or Mahamudra would have to be studied, would have to be practiced. Kamtsang's text continues to say, these are necessary for those who transmit their lineage to students, but as a practice dedicated to benefiting yourself in future lifetimes, the profound practice is to concentrate them all into one. So these are necessary for those who transmit the lineage refers, of course, to the previous sentence in which he talks about all these definitive and distinct texts which explain these distinct and unmistaken lineages. If it were our lot to eventually teach according to the one or the other tradition, Mahamudra or Dzogchen, then indeed it would be our duty to study all of these traditions, or at least one or two or three of them, and their distinct practice manuals and commentaries to such an extent that we would be able to teach any of these particular lineages in its entirety, in its unmistaken and very own distinct way, to pass them on to teaching to students in such a way. If, however, we aim at bringing about benefit through practice, if it is not our aim to teach, within any of these traditions, Mahamudra or Dzogchen for that matter. If we simply aim at bringing about benefit through the practice of this, benefit for this lifetime as well as for future lifetimes, then it is clearly said that it would indeed be rather more profound to summarize all of these teachings into one and make that the basis of our practice.
Sakya Lama, Kumaraja, Papa, I did our Tanki and Sakya, Churuta, I did the Dharma more conversation, and in
This, of course, pertains to those who would be teachers who transmit the teachings of these various lineages. They would indeed have to study all of this in great detail and only then be able to pass these various teachings in their distinct traditions on to students. As an example, may serve the great 13th century Nyingma master who's known as the omniscient Longchenpa or Longchenpa. He was one of the greatest Nyingma masters, realized masters and scholars of his time, and it is known that at an early age he took monastic ordination at the monastery of Samye in Tibet, in central Tibet. He spent several years there undergoing the traditional education in that monastery, and then he moved on to study at all the great academic institutions of that particular time in Tibet. He met also the third Karmapa, Ranjan Dorje, and received teachings and exchanged teachings with him. He also met the great Sakya master, who is known as the protector of beings, Papa. And in this way, he familiarized himself with a great number of different teachings, different teaching transmissions, etc. and so forth.
Sherab, Lama Kumaraja, that calling Dzogchen, some Yunkin, Lama Kumaraja, Longchenpa Congress, Sherab, and Derek Lama Yins. Lama Kumaraja and then Aram Chu, Roth, and Gong. Then Lama Kumaraja Sala Pelundu, Lama Kumaraja, Mulamla, and Namkane, Samon, Bamne, Samon, which he put in the Konsala, Bamne, and Kong, Pesha Tanti Ganga, then my needed student, and Kursuma, San of Kursuma, and the Mulamti man. And then Lama Kumaraja, I Tangara, Chuji, Jibat,
we know from Longchenpa's life story that one of his main teachers was to become the master who was known as Kumaraja, who was also at the same time one of the major lineage holders of the Dzogchen tradition. So at a certain time in his life, Longchenpa then decided to go into the presence of this teacher and request transmission, request teaching, etc. from him. And as he was traveling towards the residence of Kumaraja himself, shortly before Longchenpa arrived in his presence, had a dream. In that dream, he saw a great number of birds who appeared from all over the sky and who took all of his Dharma books apart, each and every one of them carrying one or two pages of his Dharma books away. Kumaraja recognized this immediately as a sign that his destined disciple would arrive soon. His disciple, his main disciple, who would be able to fully receive and hold and transmit this particular lineage of his.
And then, Kumaraja, then Longchenpa head. Kumaraja then choose to call Mahamudra and Dzogchen. They and the Tiga Gala, and Ramadan Tiga. 시작은 시락의 기다 로마리니 로 단지 내서는 나한테는 모두를 요래 단지 주제가 로마리니 출도고 좀 뭐지 출도고 사연도 대출도는 근데 이제 봐도 그게 사마소 자 장로만 잡게 그 근데 다다 대다도 되게 자원이 요데 근데 다다 성에 바사라 해요네 다 결혼선이 추쇼가 옛날 좀 뭐가 되게 그거래 라 그래서 성에 바통 나는 그렇다니 단 그러면은 처럼 추게 토금 말이 서로를 놓고라
Longchenpa, who as I understand is also known as Sakya, eventually came towards the residence of Kumaraja. He found the following scene. Kumaraja was sitting there in the presence of many of the students. It was a tradition at this institution which he had created that all of these students would pool their individual resources, whatever grain or whatever it was that they had in the way of foodstuffs, in such a way that a communal meal for everybody could be prepared. So there were some monks, there were 2 monks whose duty it always was to collect the necessary foodstuffs, grains, whatever it would have been, from the individual students and collect them in such a way to prepare the meals. As Longchenpa then eventually arrived there and these monks approached him for his share of grain or whatever foods he brought, he said to them, well, I'm very sorry, I didn't bring any grains, I don't have any foodstuffs at my disposal, so I cannot contribute to this. At which they told him then, well, if that is the case, then very sorry, but then you will have to stay outside, you will not be able to receive any Dharma from the teacher.
아니 공대가나 성인 봐줘 그 성인 변산이 되고요. 성인 봐줘. 아니 성인 봐 보통지 rangang 봐 공. 아니 공그 성이 야당 나라는 그런 부지에 다 나라는 게 아마 그만한 그다 토금문도 다 농나고 이제 다 서로 논나마도 아니 너무 산이 나는 데서 못 찾는도 사. 아니 그럼 나보니 요랑 단도시 제도 가서 아마 그만한다게 공리 공기 샤스기 땅 아니 아마 성인 바꿔로 다 굉장히 안 좋아하는 공리와 제가 수 라쿠스 아니 공려 라면다나 해봐도 다 저라 아니 그렇지 단이 저런 거 그거문도 아니 저런 나란 게 살아 아니 추다 녀니지 추다 양다바처럼 라장지네 리나 내가 편도 참고 그래 저런 거 단이 그거문도 저런 서로랑 그거문도 그런데
Such was the situation, and Longchenpa, who, as Rinpoche just confirmed, was also known as Samyepa, the one from Samye, or the monk from Samye, because there he had grown up, he had taken ordination there, thought to himself, well, being unable to contribute to the communal meals, the best thing for me would be to leave again. So unfortunately I will not be able to receive Dharma teachings from this master, therefore I should leave this place again. Now this was a potentially rather embarrassing situation, and in order to save himself the embarrassment of leaving that Dharma congregation at the time when everybody would be aware of his leaving, he decided to get up the next morning very early and leave before everybody else would be up, before anybody else would see him. Now the teacher Kumaraja, in his omniscience, knew of Longchenpa's plan, and he sent his personal attendant to Longchenpa and said, had him brought into his presence, and he then said to Longchenpa, you are rather more special. It would be of such great benefit if you were to stay here and learn the Dharma and practice the Dharma. Therefore, I will exempt you from this duty of pooling your resources, of paying your tax of grain or whatever one would would like to call it, you are exempt from this, you will not have to do so, and please stay here, learn the Dharma, practice the Dharma, and immensely great benefit will come of this. So in this way he invited Longchenpa to stay, and he prevented him from leaving.
And they did the Lama Kumaraja, one Dharma, Dzogchen, Nyingma, and Sanya Bada, Nam, and Sanya Bada, Naran, Dasabra, Yan Samne, they got any man, Genchi, Longchenpa, Ram Jong, some of the Kumaraja, now I. They need something, Nyingma, to do it, and you can get Longchenpa, John.
She advises that we should use this time to change the tapes in order to take a sip of water and relax for a second or two. Now, the story goes on in such a way that the master Kumaraja then eventually proceeded to give all the empowerments, the transmissions, the liberating instructions of the Dzogchen tradition to the students, among them the one who was until this time commonly known as Samyepa. He gave him all the traditions, all the transmissions in their entirety, and even went so far as to name him his regent or his representative. And at this time it was that Kumaraja gave him the name under which he is commonly known nowadays, Kunjin Longchen Rabjampa, or the omniscient Longchen Rabjampa. And since that time, Longchenpa, as we know him for short, is known to have been one of the greatest scholars and at the same time realized masters within the Dzogchen tradition, within the Nyingma school.
And I can hear Longchenpa Kongwe, and Dzogchen, Lam, Rio, Dawa, Gamba, Jebeke Sola, Kagyü Temple, Dan, Longchen, Dan, so much Kagyü Temple, Dan Tang.
Then in the following many years of his lifetime, Longchenpa composed the collection of texts, which is commonly known as the 7 Treasures of Longchenpa, the famous Longchen Zöndün, as they're called in Tibetan. And in this text, he very clearly, very distinctly and unmistakably describes the basis, the path, the fruit of the Dzogchen tradition and Dzogchen practice. He clearly and distinctly describes the view that is to be adopted, meditation that is to be practiced, and the conduct that is to be adopted. These texts, this collection of texts, commonly known as the 7 Treasures of Longchenpa, were composed by him.
Kamtsang, Tsogzong, Kamtsang, I truly get on some use County around this one. Goodbye. Young, Ben, Kagyü, Kamtsang, Japan. Then I come across Japan, do some Japanese and all the Lama, the Lama, Japan is a Kagyü. And even Kagyü and Roth Ambajari, and then Drukhin Tanga Rinpoche. Tige, go to the young, Wong, Mamma, Japan, so Yori. And then Drone Kagyü, Drone to one Jitin Songani, Sunday, Tiramba, Yanko, Ondo, Dama, huge body, then I love Japan, Kagyü. That day I was again, then so Lama Japan, from that temple, good. Then from that temple, then I good. Depending on Drone Kagyü, then Mano, Pasibu. Narakama comes on in the Kama comes on the Chuji, the Mano, Pasibu. Then I was again attending social from Gamana, but Google.
The text continues to say, well-established, pure and distinct Dharma traditions are necessary for those who maintain the teaching of doctrines. This simply means to say that those who are in a position of teaching, whatever teaching it is, whatever doctrine, whatever lineage it is they transmit, for them it is necessary to follow a clear-cut, distinct and unmistaken lineage. For instance, if we were to look at the transmission of Mahamudra teachings, there we have the various Kagyü traditions through which these teachings have been handed down to the present day. There is, for instance, our own Kamtsang Kagyü tradition, which as such a distinct lineage originated with the first Kumaraja Buddhism Chempa. Within the Drogpa Kagyü tradition, for instance, the main lineage establishing master, so to speak, was the great Siddha Tsangpa, who was the very first of the Gelug Rinpoche, the heads of the Drogpa Kagyü lineage. Within the Drignom Kagyü lineage, for instance, the one who established the lineage as such is the one who is known as Drignom Choka Jikten, etc., and so forth. So in this way, this holds true, this establishing of a lineage and this handing down of a lineage in a certain transmission of teachers. This has been established in various ways, and within these lineages, these teachings are being transmitted according to the particular way in which they have been established by their originating teachers. The very teaching, or the very essence of the teaching, is none other but the word of the Buddha himself. The teachings that the Buddha himself has given on the basis, on the path, on the fruition that is being brought about by way of following such a path. And if any teacher stands within such a tradition, he would be bound to teach the tradition in a very distinct and an unmistaken way, without mixing it up with other traditions. So this holds true for those who are in the business of teaching these various doctrines, these various traditions. So very clearly this all holds true for those who are teachers of any given tradition. For them it is indeed important to very clearly and distinctly in an unmistaken way, without mixing things up, to uphold their particular tradition and teach according to their tradition. However, for the vast majority of us who are not in this business of teaching the Dharma, who are not in the business of upholding a transmission, of transmitting teachings in such a way, it is rather more advisable to train ourselves in an unbiased perception, to not give rise to pride of being an upholder or being a practitioner of any particular one lineage to the extent that we would look down upon other lineages, but to remind ourselves again and again of the fact that all of these different traditions, all of these different schools, etc. and so forth, teach nothing else but essentially the teaching of the Buddha. Accordingly, then our text continues, or Kamtsang continues to say, but if you are intent only on the benefit for your future lives, it is profound to train in unbiased, pure perception. This is what we ought to do, to view all of these various Dharma traditions as of being of equal purity, of equal profundity, and not to look down upon any of the traditions which we might not particularly or personally be involved with.
Sakya, Kagyü, Gelug.E. Men tadi ye yora mado kyu de songji ge songge de kyu e tawa tomba de ba tombi ge ba de ya zang zan yo ma.
Accordingly, as we all know very well, within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, until the present day, 4 major transmission lineages or schools have developed, which are known under the name of Nyingma, Sakya, Kagyü, and Gelug. These are merely labels, these are merely names of schools, of lineages of transmissions who fundamentally teach nothing else but the teaching of the Buddha himself. Even though they differ in name and the history might be somewhat different, the different transmission lineages from teacher to teacher may be somewhat different, the very teaching which is being transmitted by each and every one of these schools or traditions is the same. It is the teaching of the Buddha in which the basis, the path, the fruition of such a path that leads to the awakening is being described. So when it comes to the content of the teachings of the Dharma that is being transmitted within these schools, there is no difference whatsoever. So we're looking at these different traditions. They are merely named differently. For instance, the Nyingma tradition is the oldest of these traditions. The word Nyingma itself means old or ancient in such a way as to show one's appreciation for something old, for something ancient that has been transmitted to us from a long time ago. This is the tradition which was transmitted during the period of the first transmission of Dharma from India to Tibet through such masters as Guru Padmasambhava or Guru Rinpoche, Khenpo Bodhisattva, the great master Vimala Mitra, the translator Vairocana, and then other students of Guru Rinpoche like Chobrugui Jalsan, like Kawa Palse, like Nopsanjali Yeshe, and so forth. It comes to these names I can show off again. So in this way, this was the very first transmission of Dharma from India to Tibet. It was the first tradition that was established in Tibet and is therefore called the old or the ancient transmission. That is simply the meaning of the name Nyingma. Another of these traditions is the Sakya tradition. And when it comes to all of these traditions which were indeed transmitted by way of masters and translators from India to Tibet, it is important to know that no Dharma was made up in any way in Tibet. It was indeed authentic Dharma that was brought from India to Tibet, translated into the Tibetan language and then established there. The Sakya tradition, for instance, is being established on the basis of teachings which were brought by such masters as Drome Lotsawa, Bari Lotsawa, also the great Rinchen Sampo, who were all great translators who traveled to India. Some of them spent 25 years in India, others 10 or 12 or 13 years studying at the feet of various Indian masters, and who then eventually returned to Tibet, translated these teachings into their own native language, and then disseminated them in Tibet. These great translators then passed these teachings, which are based mainly on the Vajra Tantra and its explications, on to Sakya Nyingma, who was the first great Tibetan master of that Sakya tradition, and the main teaching of the Sakya tradition nowadays is known as that what we call Lamje, which is called the path and its result. That is the main teaching cycle that is being transmitted within this Sakya tradition.
And there are Sakya mental and Rambo can lawyer on bottom, can control that water, continue by me, can lawyer on board, can control that. Can lawyer on board, and then go around by the Gelug down by him, Gelug. Can control that water, they won't get me down by him, get me. Jesus then can lawyer on board, that holy Punjab, holy Gurunsi, and can control Jagola. That's around the talking board, song down, such a donkey can go to Dodon Deva. More than metal of Uncle Dio, never such a can down Deva and the head. There are Paruga around there. And he get deep and long sign of what and you dig near the lecture of that Satan, long time, but it can play on board. Then you can control Java upon your penny, then such a near that is such a then there are dancer W, the dancer Sacha, Dola, then Sacha to the 19th.
Now, how does the Sakya lineage come by its name? Sakya or Sakya literally means grey earth. This lineage, or rather the seat of this lineage, was established way before the lineage itself came into being, around the time or shortly after the time of Guru Rinpoche, of Guru Kamtsang. Among one of the students of Guru Rinpoche was a monk who was known as Kagyü. And he had a brother who was known as Kagyü, Kun being the name of their family clan. That Kagyü was a lay person, as opposed to his brother Louis Wangpo, who was a fully ordained monk. At a certain time, Louis Wangpo had a vision of a certain place which would be a very good place to establish a residence, a monastery of some kind. And he told his brother Kagyü, if you go to such and such a place, quite a distance from here, you will find a place that is completely free of any vegetation. There are no flowers, there are no trees. It is a rather desert-like place. It is a place that is characterized by the grey earth that you find there. This particularly a rather barren place for that matter. And when you go there, you will find a rock upon which there are a couple of self-arisen silhouettes or letters. When you find that place, you will know that place to be the location where it would be particularly beneficial to establish a residence. Kagyü did so, he went there, and then eventually, as things evolved and more teachings were transmitted from India to Tibet, then the lineage which later came to be known as the Sakya lineage made its residence, its original seat at this particular place that has this barren desert-like appearance. In this way, the Sakya lineage, meaning grey earth, came by its name.
And then Kagyü, and then Marbalota, Jagala, Kamtsang, and then Jata, Meta Patu, Shawana, Lasso, Lama Mombote. Taken on the sword and passing Naroba. Road to Dawa Dana, then he get Naro Chudula, so that to Palmo, Song, and Duba Lasso, to County, Dama, County, then Marbalota fell at the only Posinja, Malaria, and then Malaria, Gombo Palana, Gombo Palana, to Japanese on the Kagyü, the Tenga in the Dharma.
Now on to the Kagyü tradition, or Kagyü traditions, one should say, which literally means nothing else but oral transmission. All of these various Kagyü traditions were established by the Tibetan translator Marpa Lotsawa, who traveled, as we know from his biography, 3 times to India and studied under a great number of teachers, Mahasiddhas such as Mitrapa, Kumaraja, and so forth. His main teacher clearly was the great scholar and Mahasiddha Naropa, at whose feet he spent, as it is said, 6 years and 7 months, receiving from him and also from all of his other teachers the transmissions of the tantras of Chakkasamvara, Vajravarahi, Kuya Samaja, and so forth, the cycle of teachings that is known as the 6 doctrines of Naropa, etc. And he brought these back to Tibet, translated them into his native language, and transmitted them to his own Tibetan students. Among these were 4 main students, certainly the most famous one of which was the great master of yogins, Jetsun Milarepa, who received all of these teachings in their entirety from Marpa and passed them on to his students, the certainly most famous of which is the great master Gampopa. Gampopa became the teacher of a great number of students, one of whom was the first Marpa Dzogchen. So in this way, the various Kagyü traditions were established through the efforts of Marpa, who traveled to India 3 times and practiced and studied the Dharma there.
Kamtsang Kamtsang sing the candidate to Jegombo Bagre, Kusumtema, Ramtin, Akaram, Combo Kumaraja, songs, Tanana, Dravanyam, Kisho, and then come up at the Dzogchen, Roth, you think it's then you come from Kumaraja, young and young and Zara. There are things, they come, Kamtsung, and
within the various number of Kagyü lineages, our own one is the so-called Karma Kamtsang or Kamtsang Kagyü tradition. Now, how do we come by this particular name? This happened because Gampopa told one of his main students, who happened to become the first Karmapa, Dzogchen, to go to a certain place in Tibet which was known as Kampokanra. And he told him to go there and to practice there, and Dzogchen did as he was told, and it is said that he spent 17 years in this particular place, meditating very intensively and bringing about insight and realization. So again, based on this particular place, Kampokanra, we then come by the name of Kamtsang, which is the name for our own tradition within the various Kagyü lineages.
And it is temple and young thought from me. The color and Doja Party, other part, and Bella, the income. Then Doja, Bella, look to think it's a joy. Tatella, Joe Kadampa, soon the Jogan on the song to the Sampana, Government the Bat, Kio song, a long last of and Zing, and he give it to mine. They got that and Gelug.E Chapa, and then Kumaraja, Mahamudra and Dzogchen. And then from there, is a Kumaraja, and then Tasala, and then has a George, but the Dharma, Tenga, Mongo Sane, then Tera, and then Cardon Sama, Jolly Tumani.
And then finally to the Gelug.E tradition, which actually originates with the tradition that was known as the Kadampa or the Kadam tradition. This school or tradition originated with the great Indian master Atisha, who came from India at the time when the transmission of Dharma in Tibet was facing great difficulties. It is said that he spent 17 years of his life in Tibet. He also passed away in Tibet. He never went back to India. And he rekindled the flame of the Dharma. He re-established the teaching of transmission of Dharma in a very proper and in a very unmistaken way. And the main teaching around which all of the teachings and transmissions and meditations of the Kadampa or Gelug.E tradition, for that matter, are being arranged are the teachings which concern themselves with the giving rise to the enlightened attitude of bodhicitta, loving kindness and compassion, that which is commonly known as mind training or lojong within the Tibetan tradition. This school, which then came to be known originally as the Kadam or the Kadampa school or tradition, then continued itself until then around the mid-15th century, a master from the northeastern part of Tibet, who was known as Lobsang Drakpa, came along. He later on became very famous as the great Tsongkhapa. He was born in the northeastern Tibetan region, what is nowadays known as Kumbum, and he came to central Tibet. He received all of these teachings. He made them the focus of his practice, and he reformed the tradition to such a way that they eventually called themselves the New Kadam tradition, which were then again eventually renamed into the Gelug.E school, or Gelug.E tradition. How do the Gelug followers, or how does the Gelug tradition come by its name? Gelug, which means literally the tradition of the virtuous ones. This again goes back to the establishment of the main seat or the main residence of Tsongkhapa, and the place in central Tibet that is known in Tibetan as Rivo Gandin, which would roughly translate as the Tushita mountain, which is connected with joyous, virtuous conduct. So in this way they are called the tradition of the virtuous ones, the Gelugpa, but they're also synonymously known as the Rivo Gandin Pass. These two names stand for one and the same school or one and the same tradition. This all being the case, Rinpoche advises very clearly to not give rise to the mistaken idea this particular one tradition is good, all the others are of lesser value. That would be a completely mistaken view, a completely wrong idea. You should rather train yourself in viewing all of these traditions and appreciating all of these traditions as transmitting nothing else but the very essence of the teaching of the Buddha. Therefore, you should appreciate them all for their own, in their own particular way of teaching, and constantly remind yourself of the fact that the very essence or the very crux of the teaching that is being transmitted through these various schools is one and the same. There not being any difference whatsoever. Again, let us now conclude by way of dedicating whatever merit has been accumulated here for the second welfare of being.